My presentation today is titled The Geological and Historical Impacts of the Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1755. The earthquake was one of the most devastating natural disasters in European history. The disaster profoundly impacted European thought, particularly challenging Enlightenment philosophies and prompting discussions on divine providence, human suffering, and the role of government. Marquês de Pombal, the Prime Minister, led an impressive and innovative reconstruction effort, rebuilding Lisbon with early anti-seismic architectural techniques and a modern gridded urban plan. The earthquake also spurred early scientific interest in seismology and was one of the first instances of international disaster relief. In this engraving, an artist has illustrated what Lisbon looked like just before the earthquake of 1755 struck. In Lisbon, the earthquake was followed by an immense tsunami. Many churches were full of worshippers attending Mass when the earthquake struck, leading to a particularly high number of casualties within religious buildings. The powerful shaking of the earthquake occurred first, causing widespread destruction of buildings. Approximately 40 minutes to an hour after the initial tremors, the tsunami waves began to arrive, rushing up the Tagus River and further devastating the city's downtown area. Fires ignited by overturned candles in churches and cooking fires during the earthquake also spread throughout the city, compounding the disaster. The timing of the disaster on such a significant holy day also had a profound impact on theological and philosophical thought across Europe. The earthquake occurred on November 1st, which is All Saints' Day, an important Catholic religious holiday at 9:40 a.m. The earthquake was one of the most destructive and deadly earthquakes in human history, killing more than a third of the entire population of the Portuguese capital. Tens of thousands of Portuguese who survived the earthquake were killed by the tsunami triggered by the earthquake, possibly the greatest natural disaster in Western Europe. Survivors rushed to the open space of the docks for safety and watched as the water receded, revealing a sea floor littered with lost cargo and old shipwrecks. People fled the falling buildings and fire and went toward the river, then were drowned by a tsunami wave. The Great Lisbon earthquake occurred on Saturday, All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1755, at 9:40 a.m. It was Saturday and a great religious holiday in Portugal when the great earthquake struck. Most of the people of Lisbon were either already in the churches or on their way to them. According to an eyewitness, a strange, frightful noise underground, which resembled the hollow, distant rumbling of thunder, was first heard. Soon as the quake started, the churches began to rock and sway. The heavy chandeliers began to swing above the heads of the terrified parishioners. Most of the people ran to the streets. The first shock was succeeded by a more violent and longer-lasting shock. To get perspective and to set the scene, let's see what else was going on in the world in 1755. What else was happening in 1755? Industrial revolution was just beginning in England. Europe was in the midst of the Age of Enlightenment. April 15, 1755, Samuel Johnson's A Dictionary of the English Language, published in London. April 19, 1755. The battles of Lexington and Concord were the first battles of the American Revolution. September 8, 1755, Battle of Lake George in the province of New York. British Army beats French. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, in North America. In 1755, the major reigning monarchs across Europe were Great Britain, King George II; France, King Louis XV; Austria, Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor Francis I; Portugal, King Joseph I; Pope Benedict XIV; Spain, King Ferdinand VI. The earthquake created a psychological, philosophical, cultural, and scientific revolution. This major natural disaster that had everybody's heads spinning, scientists, religious leaders, philosophers, and monarchies. It brought the Portuguese Empire to its knees. The earthquake destroyed 70% of Lisbon's buildings, 23,000. The financial cost accounted for 32 to 40% of Portugal's GDP in 1755. Two major aftershocks occurred on December 11th and December the 23rd, 1755, and caused added agony and despair to survivors. And strong aftershocks continued for many weeks. Fanned by steady northeast winds, the Great Fire burned out of control through the ruins of the city for more than 3 days. Lisbon's magnificent museums and its magnificent libraries, housing priceless documents and papers dealing with the history of Portugal's great past, burned to the ground. Also burned was the king's palace and its 70,000-volume library. Over 200 fine, priceless paintings, including paintings by Titian, Rubens, and Correggio, were burned in the palace of the Marquês de Pombal. There are 4 main factors that combined to cause the utter destruction of Lisbon after the Great Lisbon earthquake. Direct earthquake shaking. Being close to the river, the soft alluvial soils in the downtown area near the river Tagus amplified the seismic waves, leading to more intense shaking. Liquefaction. The water-saturated sediments beneath the Lisbon downtown area were highly susceptible to liquefaction, causing buildings to sink, tilt, and collapse. This concept will be discussed later in detail. Tsunami impact. The low-lying downtown area was directly in the path of the massive tsunami waves that surged up the Tagus River, inundating and sweeping away what the earthquake hadn't already destroyed. Fires. The narrow, densely packed medieval streets of the downtown Lisbon, combined with the collapse of buildings which contain numerous open flames from cooking fires and candles, especially on All Saints' Day, led to massive, uncontrollable fires that consumed most of the remaining structures. The earthquake was primarily caused by strong movement along a complex tectonic boundary in the Atlantic Ocean, specifically involving the Azores-Gibraltar Transform Fault, where the African and Eurasian plates converge. While the exact fault or set of faults is still debated, it is understood to have been a large fault, or faults that penetrated deep into the Earth's mantle, contributing to its immense magnitude and the devastating tsunami that followed. This is a computer simulation of fault movement that creates an earthquake, which sends an enormous shock wave through the water column to the shoreline. This animation shows the effects of a tsunami on nearshore areas. The water withdraws from the shoreline and exposes shipwrecks, fish, and other items. The natural reaction is to go in and get it. But then a few minutes later, the water draws in, and since it is in a shallow basin, the amplitude of the wave is huge. Vulnerable Lisbon Bay was flooded with a surge of tsunami waves. Approximately 40 minutes after the earthquake, a tsunami emptied Lisbon's Ueras Bay to more than 1 mile out. The enormous tsunami wave was 50 to 66 feet high and engulfed the harbor and downtown, rushing up the Tagus River. Water rushing up the Tagus River, so fast that several people riding on horseback were forced to gallop as fast as possible to the upper grounds for fear of being carried away. The 1755 Lisbon tsunami reached the eastern shore of North America, including the Caribbean and parts of Canada, approximately 7 to 10 hours after the earthquake. While significant in some Caribbean islands, the impact on the main U.S. East Coast was generally minor. The widespread physical effects aroused a wave of scientific interest and research into earthquakes. The tsunami struck nearby Huelva and Cadiz, where 2,000 died, as well as Madeira, Azores, and the Canary Islands. In the Azores archipelago, almost all ports were destroyed by the tsunami as the sea reached 150 meters inland. Shocks from the earthquake were felt throughout Europe as far as Finland and North Africa, even in Greenland and in the Caribbean. The tsunami struck England and was detected across the Atlantic Ocean in North America. It was later discovered that there were reports of damage caused by gigantic waves off the coast of Brazil. The Lisbon earthquake led to the first concerted effort at disaster control, modern urban planning, and the birth of seismology. Only the Pompeii, San Francisco, Fukushima, and Banda Aceh earthquakes and tsunamis are comparable in economic and psychological impact. First Marquês of Pombal became an activist prime minister. King Joseph I had suffered a nervous breakdown in the aftermath of the earthquake and left the matters of state to his prime minister Pombal. Pombal had a strong background in law and history from the University of Coimbra, followed by a distinguished diplomatic career as ambassador to Great Britain and Austria. These experiences exposed him to Enlightenment ideas and modern governance, shaping his future reforms. Pombal created a coordinated, centralized plan for recovery. The first Marquês of Pombal was an activist prime minister. Pombal was swift and competent in his leadership in the aftermath of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. He was instrumental in creating a written survey that was sent to all the parish priests in Portugal immediately following the earthquake to survey the damage in their respective parishes. Pombal desired strictly factual observations, such as what time the earthquake began, how long the shaking lasted, and whether there were any abnormalities observed at sea or along the rivers and springs. The 646 responses that Pombal collected illustrate how Lisbon was destroyed by the earthquake and the tsunami. Pombal learned valuable lessons from the study of post-earthquake damage. Survey of damage concluded that fires and building collapse were critical factors. Certain type of construction and city layout exacerbated the tragedy. Fires started in churches after altar candles were caught in collapsing drapery, etc. Building heights should be restricted. Less weight and height should be introduced in building construction. Timber framing was a good construction idea because it creates a resistance to shear waves with horizontal component as experienced in the Lisbon earthquake. In addition, it was concluded that the city needed a wider street layout. Architectural details and ornamentation should be kept to a minimum and be simplified. Building styles were strongly influenced by Sir Christopher Wren's London. Fire breaks between the roofs of adjacent buildings must be introduced. It had been noted that timber-framed buildings had resisted ground shaking, so a system of cross-braced timber framing known as the Giola cage was adopted with masonry cover for aesthetic considerations. Methods of mass production and prefabrication were used to speed construction, to enforce uniformity, and to ensure quality control. What we know today and Pombal deduced after observations of the Lisbon damage is that seismic surface waves are most damaging to buildings because they have a rolling and side-to-side motion or horizontal shearing. Stiff buildings are those that are smaller, rectangular, and low to the ground and can withstand this type of motion. But large, tall buildings like palaces, churches, opera houses have low building stiffness and easily crumble under such motions. That is why he introduced the Pombal cage construction. Shown here is a geologic map of Lisbon showing deltic, loosely compacted soils, yellow, deposited by the river Tagus, which are susceptible to this shearing motion. Sands are shown in yellow. Sands experience the phenomenon of liquefaction, to be discussed next. In Lisbon, the greatest damage occurred in the sandy or silty sediments. Higher ground areas or areas of hard rock basalt and granite areas were not damaged. Thus, geological composition of the rock formations dictated the damaged areas. The Jerónimos Monastery, an iconic site in Lisbon, was built during the 16th century. Jerónimos Monastery survived the 1755 event because it was built on harder rock and using excellent material and construction methods. The Aqueduct das Águas Livres survived. It opened in 1748, construction started 1713, and used superior construction methods. So the combination of excellent engineering, robust materials, and construction on more stable ground for both the aqueduct and the Jerónimos Monastery were crucial factors in their survival. The far-reaching effect of the Lisbon earthquake, La Alberca, Spain, 245 miles away from Lisbon. These staples were used to repair a crack in the church in La Alberca, Salamanca, Spain. The crack opened after shock waves from the Lisbon earthquake reached the town. When an earthquake hits, saturated loose soils can temporarily lose their strength and behave like a liquid. This is called liquefaction. The shaking causes water pressure to build up between soil particles, pushing them apart and making the ground unable to support structures. Buildings can sink, tilt, or even topple over, and the ground can crack and flow like a fluid. The 1964 Niigata, 1989 Loma Prieto, and 2011 Christchurch earthquakes share a critical similarity. They all caused widespread and severe damage due to the phenomenon of soil liquefaction. In each case, strong ground shaking, often amplified by soft, saturated soil conditions, led to the temporary loss of strength in the ground, causing it to behave like a liquid. This resulted in significant structural damage, including buildings tilting, sinking, or toppling, and extensive lateral spreading and settlement of the ground. These events, particularly Niigata, were pivotal in bringing liquefaction to the forefront of geotechnical engineering, an earthquake-resistant design underscoring the vital importance of understanding local soil conditions and their susceptibility to this devastating phenomenon. The diagram and chart shows the many earthquake events that have occurred on the Iberian Peninsula, with the 1755 event being one in a history of significant occurrences. Beyond the catastrophic 1755 Lisbon earthquake and tsunami, which profoundly impacted the entire region and beyond, historical records document numerous other destructive events across Spain and Portugal. These include major quakes in areas like Granada and Murcia, often leading to widespread building collapse and casualties, demonstrating that seismic hazards are a persistent and recurring feature of the peninsula's geological landscape. The Azores-Gibraltar Fault is shown on the diagram. It is a major complex plate boundary in the eastern Atlantic Ocean, marking the active interaction between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. It's responsible for significant seismic activity in the region, including the generation of powerful earthquakes and tsunamis like the devastating 1755 Lisbon event. The relative plate movement between the African plate and the Eurasian plate is shown on the diagram, the cause of the major movement being the northward movement of the African plate relative to the Eurasian plate. In addition to the compressional forces between the African and Eurasian plate, the Azores-Gibraltar Fault exhibits a complex lateral movement primarily characterized by right lateral strike-slip motion along its central segment. However, this transform movement transitions to convergent compressional forces further east, where the African and Eurasian plates are pushing against each other, leading to thrust faulting and significant seismic activity near the Iberian Peninsula, which also explains the thrusted uplifted beds, which emblemize the Rock of Gibraltar as shown on the diagram. The 1755 earthquake was viewed as Armageddon and shook the religious and intellectual foundations of Europe. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake caused a major religious shock in Europe because its timing on All Saints' Day and immense devastation challenged the belief in a benevolent God overseeing the best of all possible worlds. The religious majority saw this event as a sign from God, a punishment for wrongdoing. As a result, after 1755 Lisbon earthquake, the Spanish Inquisition burned people at the stake to atone for the city's sins. The Lisbon earthquake was a sign from God, but they did not know how to interpret it. Was it punishment for their or other people's sins? The date, All Saints' Day, some thought was chosen because the saints begged God to punish the religious transgressions of the Inquisition. They thought it was a sign of God's mercy warning mankind of the end of the world and giving the people a time to repent. Voltaire's work became the quintessential literary expression of the intellectual crisis triggered by the disaster. He asserted instead that the disaster revealed the weak, helpless, and ignorant nature of humankind. He wrote scathing satire of the Church and its injustice and intolerance, including in his Candide direct references to the Lisbon earthquake. Voltaire's pessimistic position eventually was taken up by the Enlightenment movement of the day. Voltaire's poem on the Lisbon earthquake described the suffering caused by the earthquake and asking why an omnipotent God could not have created a world without such catastrophes. Voltaire was convinced that there could not possibly exist a benign, all-loving, or intervening deity who aggrandized the virtuous and punished the sinful. Rather, God was removed from everyday life. But he still was a theist. He still believed in God, but was profoundly confused as to why he was so unjust. Immanuel Kant, on the other hand, looked at the Lisbon disaster as a natural occurrence not a divine intervention. Kant endeavored to show that earthquakes have purely physical causes and that they should not therefore incite fear. He explained earthquakes are caused by the conflagration of a mixture of iron filings, sulfur, and water that has been compressed in caverns below the Earth's surface. Voltaire and Kant had significant doubts about the religious interpretations of the Lisbon earthquake. On the other hand, Leibniz was more of the old school philosophy and tried to explain the challenging positions of the Enlightenment period. Leibniz tried to justify the existence of God and his acceptance of evil with the concept of free will. He championed the concept of philosophical optimism that tries to justify God and answer the question of why God permits evil. What was known about earthquakes at the time? Aristotle tried to explain earthquakes as winds trapped in cavities in the earth. Newton in 1730 conjectured that earthquakes were an accumulation of explosives, sulfur and iron filings, inside the earth in his thesis, Optics. Having traveled extensively, the Spanish conquistadors knew about the occurrence of tsunamis from their experience in Chile, and also Japanese experienced tsunamis. The Lisbon earthquake spurred thinkers to investigate the causes of earthquakes and tectonic events. The Lisbon earthquake ignited the beginning of seismology and geology studies. The first earthquake studied scientifically for its effects over a large area led to the birth of modern seismology and earthquake engineering. 1756. Marquês de Pombal was the first to attempt an objective scientific description of the broad causes and consequences of an earthquake. He is regarded as a forerunner of modern seismological studies. Cambridge natural science professor John Michell published a report in 1760 which detailed his theory of the origin of earthquakes, focusing on wave propagation, and concluded that the Lisbon earthquake originated in the eastern Atlantic. Could the Lisbon earthquake happen again? A major earthquake in the Lisbon region could certainly happen again because the African and Eurasian tectonic plates continue to interact along the active Azores-Gibraltar fault zone, building up stress that will eventually be released. While an earthquake of the exact same extreme magnitude, 8.5 to 9.0, as the 1755 event on that specific offshore fault segment, is estimated to have a very long recurrence interval. Perhaps every 3,000 to 4,000 years, the broader region is still seismically active, and smaller but still highly damaging, earthquakes from other local faults are a more frequent concern. However, studies have found that Lisbon has a significantly improved resistance to earthquakes due to the advancement in structural engineering and seismic building design in the past centuries. Thank you for watching, and please press the like button below if you enjoyed this presentation. The like button is that little thumbs up symbol. We are planning to add many more presentations covering a wide variety of science, history, and other enriching subjects, so please subscribe to our channel by pressing the subscribe button below. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please feel free to make them, and we will do our best to respond. Again, thanks for watching, and please do subscribe.